It has been almost a year since the release of Warhammer 40k Darktide. You know, the Vermintide sequel that was set in the new time era. But this has been an interesting one, because since the Vermintide games were almost across the board positively received, Darktide was a little bit different. Warhammer 40k is way more popular than fantasy. So what happened? What went wrong? On the 30th of November 2022, we started with 100,000 concurrent players. It was a massive hit upon release, with a huge player base and a lot of hype built around it. A Left 4 Dead style co-op shooter in the franchise of one of the most successful co-op shooters in the last decade. And set in the 40k universe, there was no way this wasn't going to be hugely popular. Yet even now, it still has a huge amount of mixed reviews on Steam. And this, I think, is down to the basics of Darktide, because whilst it has some really cool features and improves on a lot of things that Vermintide and Vermintide 2 never had, in terms of the base and core, it is a less evolved game. It is less refined, and it is lacking in a ton of content. To start, you can't select custom missions. You have to go up to this mission board and rely on the presets that are given for you. You're not able to customize or suggest things for you or your friends to play. This is a massive step down from Vermintide. You cannot craft any weapons that you want to. Instead, you have to rely on the random store that gives you completely useless items most of the time. There's also the notion of a huge amount of microtransactions within it, and whilst mostly being cosmetic, it still affects the gameplay, locking content behind a paywall that people didn't get within Vermintide 2. There is also no cross progression. That means materials and currency will stay on your character. So if you want to switch over and play a more magic orientated guy, you have to completely start again. Now for me, that's not the biggest of issues, and I kind of understand why, but I think at least the option should be there, whether you want to restart or just respec into new things. But one of the main core features that is lacking, at least for me, is the class system. There are no subclasses. In Vermintide 2, you had 5 different classes, each with 3 classes in their unique skill tree that can change how you would play those characters. Me, for one, played the archer character a lot, but I could often take out knives rather than big swords as my secondary, or I could take out a crossbow rather than my bow, so on and so forth. But in Darktide, you don't have that. You've got the Zealot Preacher, the Veteran Sharpshooter, the Psyker, and the Ogrin, and that's it. You're limited to what we've already mentioned, the kind of lacking customization system when it comes to how they look and also the weapons they use. But within this, there aren't really any subclasses in skills. So if you're playing as the Ogrin, you're the tank, and there's no real way of changing that. If you're playing as the Sharpshooter, well, you get the picture. There is also definitely a huge bias on some of the classes. Most of the classes within Darktide have 15 to 19 different melee and 20 to 27 different ranged weapons. But the poor Ogrin gets so much less, around 9 or 10 melee and ranged weapons. It is completely neglected, and they seem to have done this with many of the classes, making sure that they're trying to push people towards certain directions, or maybe it's just a lack of focus. I think a lot of it comes down to a bit of a rushed release. Darktide was delayed already, so we already saw that there was going to be some issues with development, and now it seems that even when it came out at the end of 2022, it didn't have the content that people wanted. I think for me personally, it's the map variation that is the biggest killer to Darktide. In Warhammer Vermintide, we had a ton of different maps. Whether it was going through fields, cities, underground sewer areas, there was a ton of stuff that you could get your hands on, different areas you could play with and different terrains that you could observe. However, in Darktide, it's kind of all the same. Everything is just dark and dingy, metal-clad rafters. And I completely understand that that's just down to the setting. They went with the hive cities, and whilst it is a cool concept on the surface, being part of this squad that is sent to clear out the infected in these hive cities, when it comes to actual gameplay, it really limits them in terms of making it interesting after the first few maps. Some of the biggest reviews say that they've played hundreds of hours of this, and they still at a glance cannot tell the maps apart. Especially from the mission board system when it's just a small thumbnail. It all looks like some generic dark, fiery pit of death. You can't actually see what you're going to be getting, meaning that you can't prepare for said mission. But it doesn't really matter anyway, because they're all incredibly similar. Moving through each mission, you fight some easy baddies that get harder and harder. You then get to a point where you had to defend an area, maybe put in a few codes, or even fight a couple of bosses, and then it ends. And that's it. And whilst Warhammer Vermintide had those kinds of missions, there was at least plenty more of them in different areas to give a bit more dynamic variation. But Darktide, it just doesn't have that. There are other things like a kind of lack of story, and, well, what story there is, it's kind of a bit lazy, but it's mostly the gameplay for me. You see, the gun shooting is good. The melee combat, as always, is perfection. Hacking through thousands of enemies is just as satisfying as it ever was, especially with blood splatters, and I love the atmosphere that they've created going through these darker tunnels. But it just isn't enough. It doesn't warrant it as a full game. For me, at least at the moment, it just feels like it should have been a DLC for Vermintide. It doesn't warrant that full price tag, and it's because of the amount of content. They need bigger maps, varied maps, more customization with classes, and, well, the missions need to be customizable. When you play a mission and you fail it, you should be able to retry it and go back to it, not just hope that it's still on the mission board for you to try again at a later date, because sometimes it just disappears and you have to wait until it pops up. Not being able to choose the difficulty of each mission, just being given a random preset. I thought we were past this in gaming, but it still seems like they're using such old-fashioned values when it comes to co-op and online titles. But I love Fat Shark. I love what they did with the Vermintide games, and I still enjoy playing Darktide. But it's kind of a title that I just drop in for half an hour to an hour every now and then, not putting hundreds of hours as I guess the developers really intended. It just doesn't have the facilities for that. But hopefully that will change, because at the moment, when I'm playing it, I just think, what's the point?